Hey friends, welcome to the Miss Ink Stamps YouTube channel. This is Lauren from Lauren Taylor Made, and I'm excited to start off the new year with a fun Jungle Ruins card. I'm going to be using this large scene stamp as well as our orangutan to create a scene and background. And I'm also going to use the Perspective Floor Stencil to help add in even more dimension into that really fun scene from the stamp set. So I've started with an A2 piece of watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to line up this large stamp onto this piece of cardstock inside of my MISTI. I am going to be stamping a little off the edges, and I will trim this down before I get started in my coloring today, but I like to start with a larger piece for such a large stamp set, and then I can always trim it down to the area that I like best. I'm going to be doing some embossing, so I'm using my anti-static powder tool to add the anti-static powder before I stamp my image using VersaFine Clair in the color Pinecone. I did stamp it twice and then had to put a little bit extra on that monkey on the left so I had a nice clean and crisp stamped image. I'm using some ultra fine embossing powder in Clair since I used a brown ink, and I'm just applying that powder all over the image, making sure to cover all of the areas where I stamped, and then I'll go ahead and warm up my heat gun and melt that embossing powder down to create sections for my watercoloring. I like embossing because it creates little lines and wells for my watercoloring, and it just helps me stay on the lines a little better than if I were to just stamp it with a waterproof ink. Now that my image is embossed, I'm going to go ahead and use my paper trimmer to trim this panel down to 5¼ by 4 inches. So I'm just trimming on the different sides until the image is centered how I would like it on this size panel. I'm going to grab my stack of distress watercolor pencils, a couple of paintbrushes, my towel, and a bowl of water to do some watercoloring. Now this watercoloring did take some time. I do speed up my videos just a little bit because I am a slow crafter and I don't want to keep you here for 3 hours. So I'm just going to jump through my coloring. I will show the colors that I used and how I apply the color to my image here, but I will spare you from watching me watercolor for, half a day. So I'm going to start with the sky, and I'm using tumbled glass. So I am picking up water with my paintbrush and then applying the water to the Distress watercolor pencil. Once I have enough color on my brush, I'll just go ahead and start painting right into where I want my color to be applied. So I'm starting with a blue color to add in my sky. So I'm going through along the top edge, and I'm going to add in the areas where I think from the design would look really good as the sky. So it's going to be most of the top of the card, and then I'm around the monkey on the top, in between the different palm tree leaves and some of the vines, and just going down to about where the little plant on the bottom right, I went about halfway down. Next, I'm going to color in the trees and leaves of the background. So I'm starting with Twisted Citron, and then I'll bring in Mowed Lawn to color in a combination of greens. And right now I'm starting with Twisted Citron, but I'm going to end up going back after I add Mowed Lawn with more of this lighter green color. So for the rest of my coloring of the greens, I'm actually going to start with the darker color and then add in the lighter color. So I laid down the lighter green along the ends of all of the palm trees, the palm leaves, and then I'm bringing in the darker color and blending it into the lighter color. So I'm, again, adding water to my paintbrush and then adding the water to the watercolor pencil. And then I'll go back and forth and pick up the color just straight from the pencil until it gets until it gets pretty dry again, which I get quite a few pickups of paint without having to add more water. I would say if you don't like how dark the color is coming out, you need a little bit more water. So here you can see I'm going to go back with that lighter green and then try to blend in between those two colors just a little more. I found that the darker green, as you would expect, kind of overpowered the lighter green. So for the rest of the leaves and vines around the background, I added the lighter color second. Once I'm done with my green, I'm going to move on to the brown, and in between each color I do pick up my desk a little bit so I don't accidentally get color where I don't want it to be. So I've moved on to the browns and I'm using gathered twigs to color in the palm tree trunks as well as some of the vine details and the darker area of my monkeys. So their fur or hair will be mostly this darker brown color, but I will use a lighter brown to color in their faces and their hands and feet. So after that, I'll move on to those lighter colors, and I'm going to be using the colors Old Paper as the lightest color, and then the darker shade is going to be Frayed Burlap. So frayed burlap is what I'll use to finish coloring in the monkeys, and then I will use that to be the darkest area of my kind of ruins here. So I'm adding that darker color as the shadow and then bringing in the lighter color or Old Paper to finish coloring in the rest of this column. And I'm really just going to repeat that for the rest of the ruins, just using the darker color where I think there would be more shadow and to add more distressed look to the ruins. And then I will also use that to color in some of the tumbled bricks on the ground. And then I will use the lighter color of the two to color in the floor or the ground of my scene. So once I get that last bit of color in, I'll go ahead and finish off adding in the ground. I will say that if you're going to color in a section right next to something you've already colored, you can risk bleeding into sections, into colors you don't want to bleed into. So just keep that in mind when you're changing colors, when watercoloring, to kind of just go to a different area and then come back after it's dried. So adding in this Old Paper underneath the green, I waited until that green was dry so I didn't accidentally bleed the colors together. So I'm going to finish adding in this last bit of color into the ground part and then I'll set it aside to dry. I also stamped off camera my orangutan at the same process I did for my background, so using that VersaFine Clair in Pinecone and clear embossing powder. I did stamp two just in case. I don't like my coloring, but I think it turns out pretty good. So for him, I'm going to be using Rusty Hinge for most of the coloring of this orangutan. I'm going to go in a little bit lighter for his chest and stomach area, and then try to go a little heavier handed with the fur. I did have the original cartoon for this fandom up on my computer screen. You can see right there, going back to what I was saying about bleeding into different areas, I went next to an area that I just colored, so it didn't have enough time to dry. So I did pace myself and let it dry for a second. But anyway, I'm using the coloring of the old cartoon to kind of inspire this card. I am thinking of my grandmother with making this card for her birthday. She is a huge fan of this cartoon, and I thought it would be a perfect birthday card for her. So I just wanted to make sure I tried to match the coloring as best as I could to that cartoon fandom. So for the face, hands, and feet, I'm using Victorian Velvet. It's much more of a kind of purpley orange color in my opinion, like it's got a little bit more pinky purple to it. And then I went back in and finished coloring in the fur with that Rusty Hinge, doing my best to try to make the arms and legs darker than the stomach and chest. So now while that's drying, I'm going to move on to using my stencil to add a little bit more perspective to the ground of my background. So I'm using that top part of the perspective stencil, kind of has the same cobblestoney look as some of the details already in the stamp. And I didn't do any masking. I'm just going to go in with a small blending brush and walnut stain distress ink and add in that darker color, just trying not to go too heavy into areas where it would be covering the cobblestone ground. So those leaves, the edge of the ruins. I put my stencil about as high up as I thought I could get away with adding in this detail. And then I'm going to avoid those bricks and plants on the left. So just getting right up to the edge of those stamped images. And then because it's a small blending brush, I can kind of fit into the smaller areas and just add a little bit more dimension and perspective by adding this darker ground. And I really love this detail. I think this stencil, it really just helps with dimension and perspective for all of your scene cards, and it's really fun to add it into earlier release stamps from Miss Ink Stamps. So now that that's done, I'll go ahead and set that aside, and then I'm going to fussy cut out my orangutan. I'm just going in with some small scissors and cutting around the design. I will spare you all from watching me fussy cut as well, but you could also use, any type of cutting tool to cut out that adorable orangutan. So he's going to go right there, almost front and center on the card, but I want to add a sentiment. So I'm going to use the sentiment, "It's your day to go wild." I'm kind of playing around where I think it's going to go, but I know that I want to stamp it as well. I'm going to stamp it on watercolor paper just so it matches the rest of the card. And I'm not going to emboss it this time. I'm just going to stamp it right onto that piece of paper and then bubble cut around the sentiment as well. So you can see here I'm getting about as close to the sentiment as I did with my orangutan, just to have consistency across the card. I'll go ahead and get out my card base next, which will be a side folding A2 card base, but I'm just going to rotate it so it's a horizontal card, and I will adhere my background directly onto that card base. I will have a small border around the edge, which is how I usually like to assemble my cards together. If you don't like the white border, you could definitely not trim down the original stamp and keep it an A2 panel. Once I have that in place, I'll grab my foam adhesive, and I'm going to add foam adhesive all along the back of my orangutan as well as my sentiment. These are a 2mm thick foam adhesive, and I will use some scissors to trim down my little foam squares so they get into areas like the orangutan's arms and legs, so I can make sure there is stability behind the whole image. I ended up liking my sentiment a little bit higher up and to the right, kind of covering a little bit of my trees. And then I will add my orangutan to the almost center of my image. While I was watercoloring, I did accidentally swipe some of the green into my ground when it was still wet. So I'm using my orangutan as an opportunity to cover some of that green that I could still see on the ground. Now I could call this card done, but I love bling, so I'm going to add a few sequins from my stash. These are lemon lime green, and I thought they matched really well with the twisted citron that I have around the card in the different colored greens of my leaves and plants. So I'm just going to use a pickup tool to add some sequins around the card. Once I like how many I have in their placement, I use the same pickup tool to pick them back up again and glue them down with liquid adhesive. Here's a close-up look at how my Go Wild watercolored and stenciled jungle card turned out. I absolutely love it. I did end up stamping a sentiment in on the inside, and I'll show you that right now. I'm trying to make it a goal for myself to stamp more on the insides of my cards, but I hope you had fun today with this watercolored scene and using the perspective stencil to add to our scenes. Let me know down below if you have this set and if you've combined the stencil with it as well. Thank you so much for watching. You can find more inspiration here, the list of supplies that I use down below in the description, and most of all, have a wonderful day. Bye!